Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, was Yuri Bezmenov right? Yuri Bezmenov has made a reappearance recently as he was intercut in a trailer, an official trailer at that, for the new Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War video game. So, Tim, who is Yuri Bezmenov?
Yuri Bezmenov is an ex-Soviet KGB agent propagandist who was involved in propaganda for the Soviet Union. He sort of has a semi-standard background, and from all accounts, he's 100% legit. He was raised in the Soviet system. There's pictures. There's pictures of him, and he sort of had a standard upbringing. He eventually positioned from a more normal position to actually an office, a very high-ranking office in the KGB propaganda. But the interesting thing is he defected first to Canada, and he was actually a broadcaster for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and eventually was found out. During his time in Russia, he worked for the during time with the Soviet Union, he worked in India, and this is where he had sort of a coming of age, or sort of like a sort of to quote another classic spy movie, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It's sort of like this is when the character realizes that there's a I won't say the curse word, everything that is blank is gold. In a certain way, this character had that same realization when he was working in India. He realized the Soviet Union was just basically a colonial power, and that was mainly designed to subvert it and not designed to export equality or whatever the ideals of that they were espousing. It was actually a reactionary power in some ways. But interestingly, he gets debriefed and he gets emigrated first to Canada. I think, and then I think he winds up in Canada permanently. I'm not sure 100% about the rest of his life. But he has an interesting interview about his life in the Soviet Union, why he emigrated, or why he fled, basically. And he outlines these 4 stages, which showed up in the Call of Duty trailer. The 4 stages to him are crises. Well, actually, first of all, demoralization. And he says it takes 15 to 20 years to demoralize a country, because that's the length of education. Then the next stage is destabilization, which, again, can happen much more quicker, because once you find an event and you destabilize the country. And then his third stage is crisis, and that's where the agents will come in and take over, and then normalization. And he brings up the example of some Eastern European Soviet bloc country that got normalized. So Swithin, do you think the phenomena that Yuri is identifying is true? Do you think the Soviet Union actually had the capability to do these kind of things? Maybe it had the capability to do it within its own quote-unquote large borders. It's sort of a multinational state in some ways. But do you think his 4 stages are true? Do you think that the Soviet Union itself? Now he says that much of it's done American. Is America as good as Yuri Bezmenov says it is? And is the Soviet Union as bad as he says it is? So any thoughts on Yuri Bezmenov's 4 stages and the interview itself?
I would say on the destabilization process, I think it takes longer than 20 years. So he's correct insofar as how the current education system works is about 20 years. But for them to actually have cultural influence to alter things, they only really become particularly influential when they hit about 40, because for whatever reason, that seems to be when you get to broadly the top. And that's culturally speaking, or in any sort of, for example, you're not likely to get many executives in their 30s in major corporations or things like that. You tend to be 40 plus before you get that. So if you look at sort of like the influence of like the student radicals of, say, the 60s, they only really become influential in the 1980s, because that's when they start becoming influential. And that's when you could argue that in the British context, you get sort of the influence of sort of quote unquote cultural Marxism, sort of more social leftism etc. You have a distinct move to do this in sort of what was called alternative comedy in the 1980s, because this was away from sort of traditional comedy, which they considered sort of racist and outdated, etc., etc. So I think his destabilization period is much longer, because you need the people who are influential and important to have changed their views. And I think that's more of a 40-year process rather than the 20 years. I think he underestimates the time period. Could the Soviet Union have facilitated this in any way? Well, yes, clearly they could. I mean, his argument is, well, is it exactly the same? No, it's kind of similar to some of the arguments made by a Soviet defector in the 1980s called Anatoly Golitsyn, who argued that the Soviet Union would basically feign its own decline so it could continue its world revolutionary position from a position of what would be apparent weakness, and would engage in a clandestine activity as opposed to being a sort of obvious sort of Soviet sort of communist bloc. Well, I mean, obviously they could. I mean, they had some money. I mean, the easiest way to do this kind of thing is just to fund people who actually believe what they're saying. I mean, you might just fund them for the purposes of revolution. You don't necessarily believe what they're saying, but it's just something to destabilize the area. I mean, this is why the Marxists ended up deciding they liked the blacks after Marx said somewhat less than complimentary things about them historically, and Lenin, I think, from memory as well, when they realized that they were good fertile revolutionaries, and that's why you get sort of Soviet funding of certain Marxist groups, well, not just Marxist ones, but just sort of dissident groups focused on the race issue. I mean, in South Africa, for example. So I do think it's entirely possible that they could have directly or indirectly funded people who are ideologically of particular persuasion, which they thought would help destabilize the West. I mean, obviously, destabilization program would be to diminish the importance of the family and other sort of institutions that, say, Antonio Gramsci would have seen as inimical to Soviet revolution. And they could have done this via agencies. I mean, McCarthy was broadly right. He probably went after people who weren't communists, but the State Department was completely infiltrated by communists. So, did they have any other influence in other areas? And that's entirely possible. So, I do think destabilization is possible. It takes longer, and I do think they could have done it. Whether they did is difficult to say. And I think, as Bezmenov is right, I mean, the West kind of does it to themselves. I don't think sort of like the 60s, for example, was a result primarily or entirely of the Soviet Union. I mean, so the cultural decline you can hit really obviously after the First World War. I mean, you could probably put it even before then, but that's where you get sort of elite decadence, etc., which takes place obviously in the post of the First World War period. And then that kind of filters the more democratic sense to either the middle class or the upper middle class in the 60s, which then eventually filters down to everybody by the 1980s, or maybe 1990s. So that would be my broad view on Bezmenov.
So one of the interesting things that he says is when he first arrived, he was amazed at how the influence of Marxism, Leninism within the United States. And part of the problem is, and this is one of the things that actually interests me about the interview itself, is I would say it's homegrown in some ways, especially in the United States. Although I think the Fabians, I don't know the precise history, are to a large extent homegrown, or the trends within them in Britain, the Fabian socialists, I think, are basically homegrown to a large extent, although they might be influenced to a large extent. But here in the United States, you gotta remember, Thomas Jefferson wrote this famous letter about the Adam and Eve letter about, you reduce the population of France to one Adam and one Eve, just to have the ideals of the French Revolution exist. So as far as idealist ideology or rhetoric, the United States is full of it. Lincoln, Marx himself praised Lincoln after winning a Civil War. Marx had a positive view of the United States as well, from my understanding, according to Christopher Hitchens. There's a lot of homegrown in both the British Isles and the United States. You get the diggers in England. You get, and the Puritans actually came from them. Sort of radical ideas. No, but again, of course, they weren't radical at all areas, in particular the family, in particularly about race or anything like that. But you can see the trajectory. So yeah, I do think it, to a large extent, it's homegrown. As far as the other defector you brought up, I am suspicious, although I'm not entirely. I am suspicious of the sort of the 12D. I think is you have 1D chess, you have 2D chess, and you have 3D chess. But what you're basically subscribing is 12D chess, and faking your own death to then clandestinely control things. This reminds me of almost like a Sherlock Holmes story. I mean, this could be plausible to pull off. There's another episode we did on conspiracy theories, which is yet to be released. This is plausible to pull off. I think someone thought that Mikhail Gorbachev worked for the CIA in some ways, or infiltrated by the CIA. That was there's a retort about that, but there's certain theories which are plausible, which to me, although plausible, I deem unlikely. It seems like the Soviet Union collapsed for basically entirely understandable reasons. There's no feigned decline in it. And I also think the state capacity of the Soviet Union itself, Russia itself today, although I'm not as pessimistic as some are. I don't think Russia is a middle power. Russia is, if there's a tier 1 power of the United States, Russia is clearly a tier 2 power. It is one of the most powerful countries in the world. Economically, it pales in comparison to most smaller Western European states like Italy or Spain. Have higher GDPs, but I do think it's relevant. But I think the state capacity of the Soviet Union was always much more limited than it's both them themselves as well as its alleged enemies. One of the interesting that Bezmenov brought up was that the switch. Suddenly, after World War II, the United States went from enemy to quickly friend within the Soviet Union. And actually, the inverse happened in the United States. Actually, some of the best American World War II propaganda of Hollywood, I remember this was brought up in one of my college American history classes, was written, and that they were later banned by MacArthur, was written by, this is pro-America type World War II propaganda against the Germans, written by actual Marxists of some variety. And this is Hollywood, this is where you get the MacArthur viewpoints. I mean, was Joe MacArthur right? I mean, the problem with Joe MacArthur to me is that even if Joe MacArthur gets to ban everyone he wants to, and let's say that list is very large, and he gets to ban them. I mean, what exactly does he do with them? I mean, this is where the old Bush line comes in, where we're going to destroy capitalism to save it. I mean, we're going to destroy an open society to save it. I do in general at times agree with the sort of several libertarians' critiques of Joe MacArthur, although I think they're vastly overblown. I think there is a sort of left-wing Joe MacArthurism that goes on today. I think this video was actually taken down. But as far as back to Yuri Bezmenov, I think much of what he says, in a way, is true. Which is interesting is was the United States and Britain, for that matter, Britain as anti, was it as good as he thought it was, and was the Soviet Union as bad as he claimed it was? Any comments on what I just said, or answer to that question, Swithin?
On the last point, was the Soviet Union as bad as he said it was? Probably. Obviously, as a defector, he's probably going to say it is particularly bad, although from his accounts, he had a relatively decent lifestyle, and his concern wasn't necessarily his own material well-being, it's about what the system was doing to everybody else. So for all accounts, the Soviet Union doesn't seem to be a particularly great place. I don't think it becomes a situation where they are killing everybody constantly. I mean, I think that probably happened under Stalin and Lenin. Later on, does it do that? No, probably not. It's probably just an incredibly bureaucratic society, which is vastly inefficient in producing consumer goods, and the state never goes out of business. I mean, that's the impression it's given, say, from example from the HBO series Chernobyl. That it's just a hugely bureaucratic society. You've got to ingratiate yourself with the people higher up, so then you get promoted and so you have a better lifestyle. It's not necessarily always going out killing everybody. It's just a very sort of impersonal, unpleasant bureaucracy, really. Is America as good as it said it was? Probably not. But I do think there was a big difference between the Soviet Union and current America. That's clearly the case. I mean, America and the West need not be perfect societies to be significantly better than the other alternatives. To Anatoly Golitsyn, do I think he's necessarily correct in what he said? Possibly not, although his predictions were relatively accurate. But to your point, but that's irrelevant, really. I mean, it was more of a point that the way that they were influencing was going to go down the clandestine route as opposed to overt military force. That was my primary point there. The question then, you mentioned, was Gorbachev a member of like the CIA or something? I mean, this goes back to sort of the Soviet founding. It's something like Anthony Sutton would write about, who basically argues that the Soviet Union got off the ground because it was funded by Western capitalists. I don't know the great details of that, but they certainly got finance and arms and things from the West, which facilitated their existence. And so, to what extent sort of the Soviet Union was an independent actor, at least originally, is an interesting question. Which then brings us to the main point. I think a lot of, say, the cultural decline and the way the Western society is moving, it seems to be very much in a technocratic, progressive manner, as opposed to a communist one. I think I was always, a number of years ago, thinking, I was kind of tending more of a communist line and sort of in the line of Bezmenov. But I think what you're moving to with the cultural changes, etc., is state capitalism with highly regulated, high levels of regulation, personal control of people, and large mega corporations. Possibly something somewhat similar to modern day China, which isn't really communist. I think that's probably more the model, although probably not as obviously authoritarian, because that's more difficult to sell in the West. Yeah, the sell will be a benign scientific bureaucrary that has all our best interests at heart. Note, locking down people for their own good and saving lives and wearing masks and all that kind of thing. So I don't think we're moving towards sort of socialism or communism in that sense. But I do think kind of a destabilization of what the previous sort of social and economic order. You've got a difference between, you've got a big change in what the earlier social and economic order was to a new one. But I don't think the end goal is socialism or communism. I think the goal, at least in the West, is a scientific bureaucracy running things, and that's really become as a very sort of Western progressive phenomenon, which has really existed probably from at least the late 19th century and certainly from the early 20th.
As far as the Sutton point, to the extent I'm familiar with it, nothing like that would particularly surprise me. After all, the American Revolution was funded largely by the French monarchy early on, provide key aid in the American Revolution. So you had the most absolutist country in Europe funding what at the time were the most radical groups, and actually some of the more aristocratic members of the American Revolution, later had a lot less positive views of people like the Sons of Liberty. Like we get Bacon's Rebellion, which is sort of in the tradition of Sons of Liberty, because there is a sort of people's aspect. In general, I'd say that most of these theories. Okay, there's the conspiracy theories, and then there's the overdetermined historical theories. The idea that certain actors that ran, or certain secret societies or agreements did things, I don't necessarily deny, and I do see them. I do see that it's plausible that much of the Soviet Union was influenced by Western, British, and American capitalism, which then in turn influenced British and the United States, which then in turn influenced them back. And the other variety is the overdetermined historical theories. When do these declines start? When do these rises start? And that's another interesting thing that was sort of related by when to do this episode. It sort of relates to is such and such in decline. Is such and such in decline? Because he clearly thinks that there has been destabilization, but it seems like destabilization started earlier, as you just brought up. So then the idea that there's some guy in the Kremlin in the 1950s physically, pulling the levers, infiltrating organizations. I although I'm not a debunker as an anti-conspiracy or anti that anything, I do at times find that implausible. But I do find the interview overall to be interesting. I do find that much of his point about demoralization is correct. But again, I want to stress that much of it is self-demoralization. I can imagine a very similar, if you just sort of erase Russia from the map, I can in a way imagine almost an alternate history. Maybe it would take longer. But I think Britain would have done it to itself eventually. Self-demoralization. This seems to happen to all societies, and whether or not it was Comrade Yopov at the KGB. I do think the KGB did infiltrate many revolutions. I don't deny, and certain Latin American ones in Cuba and all these. I totally agree. Many of these societies were just straight between Soviet money or American money. In that regard, I'm right wing, so I'll take the American or British money instead of the Soviet money. But that's a lesser than two evil choices. So, within any final comments on his 4-stage interview? It's one of the interesting factors how ruthless he is in his dislike. He pulls no punches. He talks about how he had to marry different people when he had to go to places to hold them hostage. This is something very in common with North Korea currently. So there's certain ways in which the Soviet Union was this sort of wicked, alienated society, alienated bureaucracy. Much more alienated than the megacorps in the United States. So, any final comments on the interviews with him?
I would agree. I think that most of the sort of demoralization, as you could call it, is internal rather than external. Certain groups, for whatever historical reason, influential people decided that the current way of running things was bad and they needed an alternative, and they went on their way to achieve their goals, and the way that they went about to achieve their goals was to get control of, get control. It didn't not necessarily be a coordinated plan and say, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. We've got to infiltrate these organizations, this organization, this. It's more that they recognize the importance of them. And so people because you think reasonably intelligent people could go into various different fields, because they realize the importance of sort of cultural institutions went in those. This goes back to our discussion with Sean Gabb on libertarian strategy. And how the libertarians simply don't really exist in the arts in any meaningful sense, and neither do conservatives anymore. Now, whether they do exist or could exist is another question. But it's certainly the case that the left has has focused more on that than the right has, at least until recently, when they've seen, I think it's been more of a realization that that was the case. I suspect this might be historically because they didn't think they needed to control the mass media, because it didn't really exist. They maybe didn't really understand it that well. And as long as the churches were relatively stable and influential, then they would be a good conduit through which more sort of orthodox, as it were, moral and social teaching could come from. But then, of course, many churches now are CNN sprinkled with God here and there. So it failed on that account as well. But yeah, I don't think you need to point to primarily outside influence. So I still think Bezmenov's claim with demoralization, I think it's the most interesting one. Although with destabilization, interestingly, I have seen articles arguing, screenshots from adverts purporting to pay protesters and various things. I mean, that would certainly be under the destabilization aspect. I mean, whether you go as far to employ professional rioters is another question, although I suppose that'd just be a modern form of the mercenary in a certain sense. And whether that is actually taking place is an interesting question. The good old public enemy number one in certain circles for this is good old George Soros. Is he doing that via his various foundations? Possibly. I don't know. I don't think it's entirely implausible that you would pay people to go and protest to make the opposition to a current order more overt and having greater importance than it in fact does. I mean, that's certainly possible. But the main point I would say is I do think even if the Soviet Union hadn't have existed, I do think you would have likely had a similar trajectory in the West over the 20th and 21st century. Would it be exactly the same? No, it wouldn't be exactly the same. But I don't think the absence of the Soviet Union's existence would make that much difference to the destination. Tim, any final thoughts?
No, that's been very interesting, and I like the trailer overall. I don't play video games, but I do thought the trailer was hilarious, and I do think it's hilariously trolls worthy, even if certain aspects aren't true.
Oh yeah, the trailer is exceptionally well put together. It really does sell the game very well. Although as to how these kind of aspects will be integrated into the game, I think is probably very loosely and probably isn't integrated very well. But it is very funny seeing the left freak out about how Call of Duty and Activision are promoting right-wing conspiracy theories, etc., 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 displaying completely no self-awareness of the perpetual propagation of Russiagate, etc., etc. So just on that angle, I think it is somewhat amusing. I'd just like to now thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe to us on YouTube, Podbean, or on Spotify. The more subscribers we get, the higher in the rankings we get, the more people will be able to listen to this. Also, please share it with friends and family. And if you have any comments or ideas for the show, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.